right, thank you, Tony. I'd like to thank Tony Brown for planting the seed of this idea of this conference being held at BYU and for making these arrangements, to Marina Kaul and our colleagues at GGU for their hard work and their excellence over the last 10 years in promoting the American Studies Center, and to American Councils for all the support in getting here. I'm going to engage in a lot of bias confirmation, to quote Scott Wickman, and just so you know, because as an advocate, I'm forced to do that. But I also want to think about a little bit of sort of the received narrative of the humanities and of languages in the academy. And we've talked a bit about that this morning and how we might reframe that. As Tony said, I have this title of the executive director of two different organizations. The Joint National Committee for Languages was formed in 1974 by ACTFL, MLA, ATSEAL, AATF, AATSP, Spanish Portuguese, and a number of other organizations, incorporated in the early 80s. And when the lobbying laws changed that nonprofit organizations of a certain type couldn't lobby beyond a certain amount, the National Council of Languages and International Studies was created. We're now 90 members in the public and private sector, working to raise the profile of language as a profession, as I said, and to advocate for funding for language at the federal, state, and local levels. I want to also begin just with a remark on, and I'll come back to this later, language. There's an elision when we say language, and I talked a little bit, some of you at lunch about this. We use it in the academy as a shorthand for a great number of things under a fairly broad rubric, but I think when we present ourselves to the outside world, whether it's to the government or to industry or to policymakers, it does sound somewhat restrictive. And when I say language, I do mean culture, international studies, area studies, and the full range of skills that enable someone to work professionally, whether it's in the academy or in industry or in government, in the public sector. I can say as a professional in Russian, you have to be able to recognize where if someone says, "Ya pod Moskvoyu etu zimu," where does that come from? If you're a Russian speaker, you have to know that, right? You have to know that, and you don't get that without serious and sustained study of language and literature and culture. I'll talk about the language enterprise. I'm going to draw a large circle around what we are, who we are, and what we do. Some definitions of global skills, key demand sectors, and a few perspectives going forward. Language enterprise, and we came up with this term because a couple, 3 years ago, we were looking at industry and academe and government and trying to, on the one hand, be able to talk about the commonalities that everyone engaged professionally in language and culture work have, and to present a unified front, as it were, to the public. But the language enterprise encompasses everyone who enables communication among different cultures and languages. And as over the last 20 years I've worked with government, with industry, worked in academe, I've found rather striking that the people who work with language and culture generally do it for a similar set of reasons. There's a common set of core values, and it really is this idea that I'm doing this. I became a scholar of Russian linguistics and later the policy of language and so on because I was very much interested personally in this transference of human knowledge and contact from one culture to another. And I think when you look broadly at industry and government and academe, the practitioners, the thought leaders, they all share that kind of core value. As Hans said, and I actually got this at a conference that Hans ran, language is at the nexus of globalization, information, rising youth populations, entrepreneurship, self-expression, that really is the oil of the 21st century. It is integral to globalization and the national interest. This is now taken as a given, that language is integral to the national interest. This used to not be the case, and if you think of the mid-90s, and unfortunately a great deal of this was catalyzed by terrible events, but it is now, I think, well understood that language and culture are integral to the national interest. And it's one of the oldest professions. I used to think that was kind of a smart aleck, glib thing to say, but globalization itself is not new. the Hanseatic League, the contemporaneous or near contemporaneous existence of napped flint arrowheads throughout the Americas, or Celtic burial tells throughout Eurasia, indicates, and we know this now from genetic studies and phylogenetic studies of linguistic variation, that humans have always exchanged material culture, linguistic culture, intellectual culture, genetic culture. And it therefore implies that we have always had translation, language teaching, interpreting. And in fact, language is mentioned in our oldest written documents, in the Bible, the Tower of Babel, in the writings of Plato and Aristotle, one scrawling on the back of the wall of the cave, the other talking one-to-one, and so therefore that begins our earliest methodological disputes in the teaching of language, direct versus platform teaching. This is not new. But this is all to say that the underlying phenomena have existed for a long time. But what is different, as Hans pointed out, the pace, the volume, the ubiquity of information, and the ability to go pretty much anywhere in the world. I lived in Kazakhstan. When I was growing up, Americans did not go to Kazakhstan, period. It was closed. End of discussion, okay? When I was a young person, there were 20 undergraduates a year going to Russia. That now you can go, basically you go to get a visa and you can do this. You can get on a plane and go anywhere. That has changed, and it underlies a lot of what we're talking about in the demand for linguistic and cultural sophistication and the implications that has for trade and international business, diplomacy and security, all underlie and drive that. And a lot of this, it's, I think, important to recognize some of these. Now, what is the role of the language enterprise? I'll get to what constitutes the enterprise in a second. We facilitate the free movement of people, information, and ideas. We build up mutual understanding and the acceptance of cultural and linguistic diversity, and we promote the personal development of the individual. This is a formulation that the late John Trim gave us about 2 years ago in trying to describe what it is that people engaged in language and culture do. What is the enterprise? People and organizations that are directly engaged in that last slide. The translators, the interpreters, the teachers, people who do localization and globalization work, people who are multilingual professionals, people who are diplomats or businessmen, attachés who have another profession but that requires linguistic and cultural sophistication in order to carry that profession out. The people and organizations who enable those who are engaged, teachers and researchers, testers, test developers, developers of tools and materials for language learning and work. And each of these bullets could be a presentation on its own in terms of just laying out a taxonomy of what that encompasses. We estimate that in the United States alone, there are 300,000 in the public sector, educational sector, government work from the state, local, state, and federal levels, and about 200,000 additional folks in the private sector. And that's full-time employment in the language industry. It does not count freelancers and stringers and so on. The estimate that the overall value between industry and public sector is about $25 billion a year in the U.S. economy, and that starts to sound like a real number. It's more than Barbies or Pringles or some of the other things that might get cited. And then the estimates go between 50 to 80 and $120 billion worldwide in terms of the overall value of language. I think when you add the teaching of English in, it sort of inflates those numbers. That's a primary concern. But there are one of the challenges I have as a researcher is these estimates vary so widely that one quotes them with a bit of trepidation. But the upshot is, the fundamental issue is that it's in fact a significant amount of the direct value of the language industry, not talking about what it leverages in terms of economic value to the United States, but the direct value of the language industry is itself some very large, significant number. Okay, what that number is, we still don't have the very good data on. Now, I want to give a framework that lays out where does this demand come from, and this is something that we've worked on for a number of years that lays out a macroeconomic view of language as a consumer good and as a public good. And I want to focus on that idea of demand. A lot of what we're going to talk about, but what you see in this model is that capacity decisions that we've been talking about in language programming are really rest in the main on, especially in higher education, on decisions that 18 and 19, 20-year-olds make as to which courses they're going to take, and that then determines how many kids you have in your department, in your sections, and whether the dean is going to let you run those upper division courses and so on. And so one of the things we try to do is to establish this link between the underlying needs and capacity. We'll talk about demand a little bit. Demand sectors that come up are economic competitiveness, and Hans talked a great deal about that. National security, which now, as I said, seems to be self-evident. In fact, has always underlain federal funding for language and international education, and is still found in the legislative findings of our major programs, Title VI, the National Security Education Program, the National Language Service Corps, and so on. And then social services, which is driven primarily in the United States by one piece of legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VI thereof, and by Executive Order 13166, which is the executive order by President Clinton that interpreted the prohibition on discrimination by national origin to include a prohibition on discrimination on limited English proficient status. So what it means is that every federal organ, every recipient of federal funding, no matter how many steps removed from the federal government, so local agencies, doctors' offices which receive Medicare reimbursement, pharmacies which receive Medicare reimbursement, are by law required to provide their services to those who do not speak English, and at the cost of the service provider. So this actually drives, and has, in the last 14 years, has driven a very rapid expansion of community interpreting and of language services at the state and especially the local level. Economic competitiveness. We estimate that in the United States that there are at least 200 economically viable languages in the private sector. This is based on various calls for proposals, RFPs, and so on, looking at the language activity of GALA members, for example. We have the most complicated language market in the world in the United States because we have immigrants from everywhere who bring their languages and constitute heritage speakers and domestic markets for goods and services. And we have commercial interests in every part of the world to some degree. And so that means that we are working in more language pairs, I think, than any other country in any other sector. And I'm looking at Hans only because we deal with this on a regular basis with our European colleagues who like to tell us that they like to say, well, we've figured out language and you guys in the US don't understand what we're talking about. Say, no, wait a minute, we have a very complex market. The principal languages do tend, in the US, for the domestic market, mirror our population demographics. Domains for the language industry are really generally distributed equally. There's no, you find all of these more or less equally in the various principal languages. You know, there are some things like German has a heavy emphasis on finance and on medical devices and pharmaceuticals because of the types of trade we have with Germany and German companies, but nevertheless, these are really, this tries to give the lie that Spanish is focused primarily on retail services and social services, but in fact you'll find this in pretty much every language. There's a long tail effect. There are roughly a dozen larger languages, but that long tail of 200 languages adds up to a significant amount of business in the US language market. And then finally, complete language data on the US is generally lacking, and I'll come back to this in terms of the educational sector in a minute. The census, 1 in 6 receive the long-form questionnaire, 1 in 100 the in-person interview. The in-person interview is the basis for the census estimates for language population. And then interviewers have categories such as African not further specified, India not otherwise classified, so that that African not further specified covers about 2,000 languages. So we don't have very good data in the US on the number of languages spoken or on the internal market. Makes us unique, in fact, among developed nations. We don't have the old Soviet censuses, Sovietsky переписи, which asked what your native language is of absolutely everyone on the census. So that leads then to global talent. Broadly speaking, we need language, and Hans spent a good bit of time on this, but language competency at a variety of levels for a wide range of jobs. It entails cultural sophistication and intercultural ability. And when we say language, again, I cannot stress this enough because we get into these even internal arguments with, for example, I'm sorry, Catherine, with MLA, oh, you guys aren't talking about culture. Well, in fact, we are, but we're not doing it very well, and I take that point. Global skills entail additional professional domains. I cannot stress that enough, that even in language work, proficiency simply is not enough. Translation and interpreting are cognitively demanding complex tasks that are not, in fact, the same as language proficiency. And we have a tremendous gap in the United States in that we only have a handful of, and Alan Melby tracks this, of even certificate programs, much less degree programs in translation and interpreting, nor do we have very much research on the cognitive bases of translation and interpreting, on the workflow of translation and interpreting. We have a real gap compared to what the European Union is doing in terms of investing, what China is doing, what Russia is doing, where there are entire universities dedicated to translation interpreting, and there are major research programs and millions of euros, I'm sorry, I wish it were billions, being spent on this. We've talked about critical tool. Companies need workers who can engage comfortably within and between cultures and languages. There's a recent Harvard Business School study that I just saw on Monday and didn't get a chance to cite here, that says that companies that enforce English as a lingua franca run into significant problems with internal issues, and their productivity falls because you have multilingual and multi-country teams, and if everyone's being forced to use English in a meeting instead of having an interpreter to mediate the interaction, the actual level of language drops considerably. And anybody who's been to an international negotiation, say at ISO, one that's not mediated by interpreting services, has lived this, okay? And language is no longer a soft skill, and I'll come back to that. There are some structural challenges, and we've talked about some of these this morning. The orientation and mission of language departments with respect to the missions beyond academic preparation is still a significant issue. At BYU, I think we can take some very strong evidence from Scott and his colleagues and from John that in fact is not the case here, but I think broadly speaking it is. Catherine has led the MLA study that showed 94% of the majors in language do not go on to further graduate studies, and yet our programs emphasize that and prepare people for that. That's necessary. That level of cultural sophistication that you get from close readings of Pushkin or Mandelstam or Akhmatova is necessary to function as a professional in Russian. But there are other things that are necessary too that don't get included. There's a received narrative in the humanities and languages in particular that nobody cares. I think this is changing to some degree, but there's still that nobody cares about us. But public policy attitudes are remarkably supportive of language study. I reported on this at Ergegu in Moscow last May. We've done a subsequent poll since then. Highlights of that, if you ask a nationally representative random stratified sample of adults, do you think language is as important as math and science? Roughly 70 to 75% will say yes, and that's held steady. Questions like that, that's held steady for some 15 years. We also see that among a younger generation, younger cohort, that the answers are actually much more positive in favor of language study, and that they correlate very highly with attitudes towards all sorts of other indices of tolerance. Tolerance for alternative lifestyles, tolerance for gay marriage, tolerance for multiculturalism, for political diversity. And that's all of a piece, I think, that in the United States at least, there's a population under 35 or so, and that includes a lot of younger parents, who grew up in a very different world than most of us, and who expect multilingualism and diversity, and expect to see that. And that's reflected in attitudes towards language learning. It's also reflected now in K-12 investment in foreign languages in a number of states and major school systems that are investing in language because parents are demanding it, because where there are robust or at least large systems of schools of choice, charter schools and so on, that are offering languages, that parents are walking away from the public schools. We see this in DC in particular. But also in Kentucky, Tennessee, making strategic investments in language as a professional skill for the 21st century. We have anecdotal evidence of growth. There are, at least from reports of the associations of teachers of these languages, shortages in the K-12 world for teachers in a number of languages, French, German, Spanish, and other languages, but we have no data. We have no data on programs and growth since, and enrollments since the data were last published in 2009. That represents data that were collected in 2006 to 2007 because the Department of Education canceled that program. It's a vitally important part of Title VI that we don't actually have the data. Now, NSEP has just put out an RFP to perform a census of K-18 enrollments. They need to about quadruple the amount of money behind it to actually get what they want, but that's a different discussion, and we'll take that up with Mike. And then language jobs. There are jobs out there. There are jobs in the federal sector, and we've talked a good bit about that. Language entails culture. I've said that again. I cannot repeat that enough. When you actually get into the ILR and ACTFL skill levels, the language proficiency descriptors themselves, setting aside the cultural proficiency descriptors that have been developed by the ILR, the language proficiency descriptors, when you get to the 2, to the 3, to the 4, to the advanced, superior, distinguished levels, culture is explicitly and implicitly entailed throughout, and the ability to master, you can't function at those proficiency levels without being able to function in that culture. But we do lead this in our link in our presentation to the outside world. Now I'll talk about some new initiatives and some perspectives. And there are 3 up here, and I've got different font sizes. I don't think I've found any typos yet, which is really amazing since I'm almost done. Straight F's in typing in junior high school in 1980, because really we were going to be speaking into our computers at any time, and who had to learn how to type, okay? The Gala Global Talent Program, Hans and I have talked about that to some degree. We're now starting our gap analysis. We'll be piloting a survey to, an open forum survey to develop a closed forum survey, and then developing really demand signals for education. Languages for All, which is an initiative of, led by CASEL, but including ACTFL, JNCL Nicholas, Gala, the Center for Applied Linguistics, and I'm probably missing some folks, as well as the British Academy, which is the British Academy for the Humanities, which is a quasi-governmental body similar to our national academies, the American Academy for Arts and Sciences, and the Australian Academies for the Social Sciences and the Humanities, to look at some common challenges for language education in Anglophone societies. We tried to get the Canadians, but I think we put our foot forward a bit incorrectly because we said Anglophone, and I should know better, being part Canadian myself. But we'll get the Canadians in eventually because they have similar issues there. We held a summit on September 30th at the University of Maryland that a number of you attended. And the idea that we have is that accessible language programming to high levels of useful skill is feasible, but it requires significant work in terms of expanding access to best practices, in terms of disseminating those best practices, in terms of raising awareness among educational policymakers, especially at the local level, at the decanal level, not here at BYU, but elsewhere. And I have a number of good friends who are deans, so I think I can get away with saying that, at the level of school boards and superintendents, that in fact this is doable and that in fact it has significant educational, cognitive, and career benefits. We have an organizing committee, and a secretariat will be established in the near future, and a PR campaign will be sort of the first steps that we take towards an eventual goal within 5 years of dramatically expanding the number of American children who are taking language, whether in primary, secondary, or tertiary education. And then the Partnership for Languages in the U.S. Plus, and I know that Dana and Matt and I don't see Kurt, but a number of folks at BYU, you put your glasses on, Kirk, so I didn't recognize you, are involved in the Partnership for Languages in the U.S. This was a meeting that was held, an organizational meeting was held in Austin with participants from 45 institutes of higher education coming on their own dime to Austin to spend 2.5 days in November talking about languages and language programming and the idea of really revolutionizing the way we approach language in higher education, and with French and not just the less commonly taught and critical languages, but French, Spanish, Portuguese present as well. A number of deans, directors, vice presidents, vice provosts coming and putting some emphasis behind the idea of a new organization. And so, you know, the old adage from Watergate, you follow the money. where we have those institutions ready to invest in membership in an organization, and we have 3 institutions competing for the secretariat and offering to put money on the table to host it. And I say this because, you know, one of the challenges that I have at JNCL Nicholas and we have as a membership organization is really in higher education, the points of leverage are very different than in K-12. In K-12, if you get 20 angry parents to come to a school board meeting 2 or 3 times in a row, policies do change. School board meetings are generally broadcast on local cable, parents vote, it's covered in the local papers, et cetera. Higher education can be a little harder to influence. Parents write checks, and maybe or maybe not they're paying attention to what their kids are doing, you know, or paying close attention. And I don't mean to be glib, but here's a model that says, in point of fact, there's a great deal of interest in higher education in the U.S. in language programming among this subset of schools that would like to take the flagship model and not even just replicate it, but expand it and evolve it and change it and adapt it to their situations and then expand it beyond that group. So that's another new initiative that we hope will be announced in the near future. Actually, the RFP is out for the hosting for the Secretariat, and that'll be under review in about 2 weeks. Language and STEM, and the last bit, and as Hans said, language, so you know, STEM is great. We have this big emphasis in the U.S. on STEM because as some of the charts that we saw earlier on the percentage of graduates by discipline, we're actually a fairly low number of graduates in things like the physical sciences and engineering as a percentage of the overall undergraduate population. And when you look at PhD degrees and advanced training, the majority of our STEM degrees are awarded to foreign students who then have to go home in the main. So we face a STEM deficit. Now, there is nothing new under the sun. This was the impetus for the creation of the National Defense Education Act in 1958 when we were falling behind the Soviets because, forgive me, Marina, Rafaelna, we didn't have enough engineers in the United States and you guys beat us into space, you know. So again, nothing new under the sun. And so there's a lot of emphasis on STEM, and we said, well, let's get language into STEM. Well, one thing about Washington, if you have a good acronym, it's not going to change, right? Now, the arts have tried to get STEAM, and they haven't gotten STEAM, and there's no way we're going to get anything with an L in there that I'm not even going to try to pronounce. So we took a different tack in actually meeting with the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House, which is responsible for coordinating, among other things, STEM education across the U.S. government, the National Science Foundation, the National Institutes for Health, the Department of Education, the Department of Defense, a number of other STEM initiatives. And in our discussions there, we said, well, actually, when you look at research and development money in the United States for language, applied linguistics, almost all of it comes from things that are already formally labeled as STEM accounts. There's a tiny little bit in the Department of Education that is not STEM, but everything else, DARPA, IARPA, the National Science Foundation, DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency that gave us the internet, among other things. The National Institutes for Health, NIH, the Department of Defense Research and Engineering Office. The foreign language work, as Hans indicated, is highly technologized, teaching, translation, and interpreting. And that technological aspect and the use of technologies in the language work is in turn driving the research and development. That we see the workflow for translation, for example, is nothing like it was 25 years ago when Hans and I were both actual practicing translators. I have a dictionary full of beautiful Russian, a bookcase full of beautiful Russian dictionaries, the 17-volume set, the 34-volume set, you know, Ozhigov, the 4-volume set, Dal, 2 editions of Dal. I don't ever use them anymore. I do it all online, you know, because it's all there on the computer. Now, there are some things like you actually have to get up and look at a dictionary. For higher level things, you know, if you're going to translate Pasternak, you're going to need the dictionary. And then the language industry is vital to the U.S. STEM industry, leveraging this $1.5 trillion in trade. In particular, in the internet industry, people who are selling information essentially, or using information to sell goods and services, whether to domestic or international markets, depend on language. So Hans was part of this presentation that we made to the Deputy Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and Ray may have been there as well. They requested a white paper from JNCL Nicholas and Gala, and we provided that in June of 2013. But the idea here that we're trying to advance is actually kind of radical, I think, for the way that we conceive of the humanities and language. We are already part of this STEM, not in so much the instrumental pragmatic sense, although there's certainly an element of that, and I know John's going to talk about that. But that what's happening over the horizon, on the periphery of our work, being done by younger people who are doing incredibly innovative things, whether in business or in scholarship, has pulled language into science and technology. We'd already been there with linguistics, and with computational linguistics in particular, and some of applied linguistics. But it's a way of maybe reconceptualizing where we stand in relation to that other side of campus, which is concerned with zeros and ones and nuts and bolts and things. That we have something to say there, and sometimes I get a pushback that says, well, but my job is to teach François Villon or to teach Akhmatova or what have you. That's who I am. But the analogy that one can make, and I think it's apt to a pretty good degree, is that when you're taking calculus, you're not necessarily working on anything that's particularly high-tech. Calculus is 400 years old, after all, Leibniz and Newton. But what you're doing is laying foundational bases for future work in much more advanced fields. And so that's the caveat I would add to that. And then Jay and Sale Nicholas I've talked about. It's just, we work very much as well on industrial standards and trying to make these connections among industry, academia, and government. And glad if you go to our website, languagepolicy.org, you can learn more about us. But with that, I will conclude.